you are having a wonderful, restful, peaceful Sabbath day. I will say I was remiss last week during announcements to wish all the fathers a happy Father's Day. I hope you had an enjoyable day. This is the saddest week of the year. It's 51 more weeks now till Father's Day again. So it's been a hard week. I'm not going to lie to anyone. It's my favorite day of the year. But we'll manage through. We'll get there. 51 more weeks, guys. But I hope you had an enjoyable day. Secondly, I just want to mention as well, this morning my wife was in the kitchen getting some things done, and she had a sermon playing in the background, and then she went to another sermon. I said, what are you doing today? So I just want to make sure I got something that's going to be good. So that kind of support, you really, you know what I mean? You really can't get that everywhere. But no, joking. Sometimes I want to set the record straight. I might paint this picture of my wife, but no. She is absolutely supportive, and any good comments that I might have when I'm up here, really, you got to go back to her because that's usually the genesis of it. So I say that tongue-in-cheek about not sure what she was going to get today. But anyways, I did appreciate the sermonette. It's amazing sometimes how these messages go hand in hand, especially when you assign them. It works really well. So, again, I appreciate it, and I think you'll see a strong link, hopefully, between the two messages. So I'll start out this afternoon by asking you a question. What would you say is your greatest fear or greatest fears? And I'll tell you a little story that happened several years ago. We happened to be in St. Louis. There was summer camp at Pinecrest. We spent a few days there. My family will know this story well. When you're in St. Louis, you got to see the arch. So we wanted to take the ride up on the arch, which all seemed very innocent until we got to the ride. And the ride you go on looks like the size of a microwave. And my two children, my wife were in there, and they said, "Come on, Dad, you got to come in. We got to go." And I don't like tight spaces at all. And I looked in and I said, "I want to go, but I can't do it. I can't. And they're like, "Come on, Dad, come on, you can do it." So against my better judgment, I got in. And, of course, you sit, then you wait, and it doesn't move, and it seems like forever. And then it finally goes, and you get to the top, and it's tight up there when you walk around. But it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. And then you come back down, and you get through, and you're like, but that's one of the things, when I look at some of the things that would plague me, that's certainly, my family is smiling in the back. They know that's one of the things that I deal with, that I'll struggle with, as a fear. Now, I run across some people, and I'll ask them that question. I was like, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm like, well, maybe that would be a wonderful spot to be, right? But I know for most of us, there's things that we are afraid of in life. Simple things like long sermons. Or things like, your health. Right? Can't that bring a lot of fear and angst? Look what we just read in the announcement bulletin. And we always ask for prayer and prayer requests for those people. There's got to be day in, day out. Your mind races, fear, concern. When you're involved or you're a family member, that's something that can be difficult. How about growing old? There's whole businesses around that to try to fight that off, where people are fighting that and fearful of that. Finances can certainly be something that brings a great amount of angst and concern and heartache when you start trying to think about how you're going to make ends meet. Right? Difficult. Or even the future. Right? How much is out there? There's a whole industry about fear creation almost, depending on what side of the political fence you're on. That the future, it can be a fearful place when you start really mulling it over in your head and what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day when you start really, really thinking about that. A lot of things can cause fear. You look at Webster's dictionary, they define fear as follows: an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. You don't have to write that down, but that's the primary one they give. Anxious concern would be number 2. Number 3, a profound reverence or awe, especially towards God. And number 4, reason for alarm. Right? That's how Webster defines fear. When you think about it, we have this Bible, we have God in our lives, right? As Christians, how is it possible we have fear? Right? If we have God, if we have this Bible, we know doesn't it seem like a bit of a dichotomy in one sense that fear could be a part of our life? So I would add a 5th definition to that and say fear is simply an absence of faith. Right? If you want to look at fear as we sit here this afternoon, you boil it down, because when I looked at everything that might produce or cause fear in my life, it comes back and you can pinpoint it back and say, I have an absence of faith, I have an absence of trust, an absence of belief in a power greater than myself, in someone who can do something to rectify the situation. That's simply what it is when we're really honest with ourselves, because we can say, oh, that's just how we are humanly. That's how we live our lives. We're going to have a lot of angst, a lot of uncertainty. That's the world we live in. I'm going to have some level of fear, right? But really, that's, when you boil it down, what we're talking about. And so this afternoon, I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at someone in the Old Testament who's started out as a fearful man. But we find his name mentioned in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11. So I hope you'll find it encouraging. I appreciated Mr. Crone's sermonette about David and really the confidence and where they came from. As I say, these two messages dovetail greatly, because I think sometimes as we step back in life and we say we're on this earth for a certain period of time, we wonder, what is it all about? Well, certainly God wants certain things to happen in our lives. And one of the hallmarks, one of the pillars that constantly comes back in God's Word as we go through our life is growing somehow in faith. Is it not? Is that not one of the things? And we know that roller coaster sometimes it feels like with faith. And I wish sometimes, I always think about if we had, because I have these at work, little dashboards that would be like a faith meter, right? Where am I right now? Because it varies, doesn't it? Based on what you're going through in life sometimes. Your faith meter might be really strong, but then it wavers and it goes back. And you're going to see with this person, who was what I call the Faith Hall of Fame, he had that same experience. Faith is a process, as we heard in the sermonette as well. But it's interesting, and I think it's good. It's a vast topic, one that you don't cover in one message, one that we dwell on and think about in our studies and in the course of a lifetime, but hopefully a few things just to kick around again this afternoon as we think about being a person of faith as an awesome hallmark when you think about living your life grounded that way. And I've run across people, I'm sure you have, and maybe you are one of those people, that just through situations is a bedrock of stability, who can see God's presence, who understands that God's involved. Even though it's dark and it's stormy, somehow through that process they're able to navigate, to stay calm, to have some footing. Well, I would put forth to you today that's probably maybe a little bit of who they are, or maybe as a person, but a lot of it's God's Spirit, drawing close to God. We'll see through this process how that process really works. So I want to go back to a time in the Old Testament. It's the time of the Judges. Right? Really, when you look at the history of Israel, it was a really dark time in many ways. A period that lasted more than 300 years, 12 different judges during that time period, but a very, very common theme, as we know. Right? A period of sin, punishment, people crying out to God, God being merciful, and then repeat the sequence. So it would have been a really easy flow chart, right? You went into a circle, and that's how life was. That's how it was during that time. You look in the book of Judges, it's probably not a great read right before you go to bed. I wouldn't read it right around that time, but maybe during the day. But several times in there, twice it mentions everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? And I think about the time period that we live in today, right? Doesn't that sum up society? And if we're not careful, it can even sum up how maybe we approach things sometimes even within God's church. But an interesting comment. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and it was a period of really survival. They had gone into the promised land, hadn't really settled it yet. Joshua had died, and they were up against all the ites, right? The Hittites, the Perizzites, all those you read about in Judges. They were there, and they had to conquer them. There were a number of issues, and they were trying to make their way. And there were difficulties. And I always try to step back and think. And that's why I say when I think of Israel coming in the wilderness and wandering, I try to put myself, you try to give, at least I sense, I give a lot of latitude to those situations and the difficulties that were there. Because we look at our life sometimes on our faith meter and we see how quickly that dial can move as well. We're fortunate we don't have something recorded of our lives, but we look at others here, and it says they're in here for our edification, for our learning. And it's really great to see a man here that God used. And the title, for those of you who like titles, and maybe who's guessed who I've talked about, who I'm talking about? Oh, come on, don't be shy now. You're fearful. All right? No, you know who I'm talking. One of the judges is called Gideon. From fearful to faithful, if you want a title for the sermon. Gideon. And he's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Isn't that a remarkable thing? And you'll see why as we go through the story. I'm just going to go through some of the highlights that are found in Judges 6 through Judges 8. Just some of the highlights, and then I want to, at the end, see how that really, because what you really came for is, what can I do with this? How does it apply to me? What lessons can we take away from it? So we'll go to the book of Judges, if you want, chapter 6, just to give you a quick history. They had cycled in and out of this. Gideon was the fifth judge during this period. 40 years of peace were in the land, but now the Midianites were on the scene, and there were 7 years of the Midianites just really bombarding Israel and making life very, very miserable for them. And again, we're just going to hit a couple high spots. Judges 6 and verse 4, it says, they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, leave no substance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox or donkey. They came and they picked them clean. Right? They were basically just trying to survive. They were under siege. Right? 7 years. Now again, 7 years, I always think of time. Right? Look how quickly. You think back, I'm like, was that a year ago already? So much happens, right? 7 years is a long time when you're under siege, when you're under a trial, when you're under great, extreme difficulty and hardship. That's where we find Gideon. Gideon, when we find him, he's in a wine press. Don't ask me to tell you too much about that, but he's in a wine press threshing wheat. Right? He's hiding, basically, in this spot, trying to get some food. Right? They said normally when you, again, not being a farmer, but when you thresh wheat, you do that in an open field so you can separate the wheat from the chaff, so the wind will blow that off. But he's now hiding down low, just trying to eke out some food. Right, trying to get something to eat so they won't come and take it from him. We find Gideon now in that spot. Look at chapter 6 and verse 12. It says in verse 11 at the end, Gideon was in the winepress in order to hide from the Midianites, hide this food from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our father told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So this is where we find him, and the angel of the Lord is dealing with Gideon. And Gideon now in verse 17 says, if I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talks with me. And do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you, and I'll bring out my offering and set it before you. Wait, and I'll come back. And he brings back this offering, and in verse 21 it says, the angel of the Lord put out the end of his staff that was in his hand, touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord, so Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said to him, peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die. That's where he finds him. At the start of that story, you cannot find yourself when he says, you mighty man of valor, the Lord is with you. Anyone who's been in a long and a difficult trial, then Gideon starts to cite, how can you say that? How can you say that, seeing where we sit now? Where is God in all of this? Where is all this stuff we heard our fathers even talk about? We haven't seen much. We heard our fathers and how they were delivered from Egypt. And it's funny how quickly you can get to that spot, because if you read at the start of that chapter, they had just come through 40 years of peace before those 7 years of hardship. They had seen some good times, but he had forgotten that. He had forgotten that, and he was in a spot where he was only seeing how difficult it was. And he was consumed with fear. He was consumed with disillusionment. discouragement, all the things that fear brings on a person. And he had no hope. He had no reason until God started to show him his presence. And it's an amazing thing as you looked at that. So now Gideon has a little more encouragement because he says, wow, the God is with me. So God says, okay, we got a starting point here now. Right, we got a starting point that we can do something. Look at verse 25 of chapter 6. Here's what God says. His first step out now. We talk about faith being a process. It came to pass the same night the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal. That's all that was around there. That was the society. That's how they lived. He says, go and destroy that. His father had that altar. That was part of the family. The whole community were Baal worshipers. Right? Pretty bold out of the gate. He's saying, now here's what we're going to do. Here's what you need to do. Tear down that altar, cut down the wooden image that's beside it, and build an altar to the rock, to the Lord on top of the rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image that you shall cut down. So Gideon got 10 men at night. They did it at night. And in verse 27, because he feared his father's household and the men of the city. Right? So we got this night project going on. They tore the altar down, and then the morning inevitably came. Verse 29, all the men of the city got together, and they said, who did this thing? And they inquired, and they asked, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this. And the men of the city, in verse 30, said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die. That's how rampant the lifestyle against God was. And God said right out of the gate, now if we're going to partner together, if you're going to grow in faith, you got to go right into the fire. That's a pretty amazing thing. This is one thing alone that he asked Gideon to do. Right? It's pretty bold and courageous thing. So they basically wanted to say, bring your son out so we can kill him. Right? And the dad, look what the dad did in verse 31. Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is God, let him plead for himself, because this altar has been torn down. And he really turned and walked away from Baal. And he said, let Baal do his own work. If he's powerful, he's a God, let him do that. And it was a pretty amazing thing that God had asked Gideon to do. So Gideon took that first step. But the Midianites were still all around. Right? God had bigger plans for Gideon. He wanted him to really extradite them from the people. You know the story of the fleece, right? Everyone know the story about the fleece with Gideon. I'm sure we cover it in Bible classes. But I think it's interesting there at the latter part of verse 36, because Gideon has just come through this. He's done a very powerful thing. God says he wants him now to lead an army, to move them out. And what does Gideon say in verse 36? In verse 36, he says to God, God, if you will save Israel by my hand, I love the way it's worded here. If you'll save them by my hand, as you have said, look, okay, here's what I got. I got a fleece, and I want to put it outside. If you make the one side wet and the other side dry, we know the story, then you know what? I'm good to go. Right? It's pretty interesting. So it says in verse 38, he rose the next morning, squeezed the fleece, and he wrung out the dew. Then Gideon said to God, okay, that was pretty good. That was really good. You know, I'm with you. I really feel pretty good about this. And he says, go, but don't be angry with me. If I could just indulge you. Can you imagine being in that spot? And I mean, I'm focusing on Gideon here, but again, I hope in the backdrop we understand too, when I said, how do we grow in faith? We got to know the God we're dealing with, right? And I know I'm very thankful of that. Every day is a new start, a new day to grow in faith, to walk again and say, God, I hate to ask this again. You know, we talked about, is it going to be okay? You know, I hate to even bring this up again, right? That's what Gideon's saying. He's saying, God, you know, that was really good. You got the fleece part wet. Can you get the underside wet and not the fleece part now? If you do that, I think we're pretty close, right? You don't see lightning bolts come down. God dealt with this, you know, and so it happened. It happened here, and God did it that night in verse 40. It was drying the fleece only, but there was doing. It reminds me when we were kids. Sometimes we're so different, right? I don't know. I usually had my younger brother. I would try to get him to ask my dad things because I didn't want to ask him, right? And I'm like, ask Dad if we can watch TV. No, you ask him. No, you ask him, right? It's the same kind of thing here with God. It's like, God, I don't want to ask you again, but Aren't we that way as well? So it's so easy to identify this faith process. Why didn't Gideon just go, God, we're charging forward, right? It's great. I'll go with you. In chapter 7, now it's time to face the Midianites. And you know the story there again, but again, I think a few things become very interesting as you think about this story. He has an army of 32,000 men. Seems sort of reasonable, sort of a good start. And the Lord in verse 2 says, you know what? The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hands, lest Israel claim victory for itself against me, saying, my own hand save me. So he said, tell anyone who's afraid. There's that fear factor again. Anyone who wants out, let them go. Boom, side door, 22,000 men leave. All right? Now you're down to 10,000. Then we go through the whole process, as you know, and he finally has the men drink water from the pond. I think that'd be, if we didn't know the story and you had to go and that's how you would drink. I don't know what I would do there, but only 300 men cupped it by looking up. So now that army of 32,000 goes down to 300, less than 1%. What's interesting about this, and I hadn't realized I was looking at this, you can just jot it down. If you look at chapter 8, verse 10. When they defeated him, when they defeated that army, and it says, let's just look at something before we go there. In chapter 7, verse 12. The Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. And their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. I don't know. There was a series that was popular, I think it probably is. It was about I forget the exact name, it was about the kings, the story in 1st and 2nd Kings and some of the books that were written. Almost books you couldn't put down because they talked about these armies. And back then, if you have, soldiers on horseback coming, it would have felt like if they had a train or an earthquake coming, the size of an army. We've been up to Counter Prairie to watch some reenactments, which is cool, but it's not this size army, right? Look down into a valley. And God says, no, your army's too big still. Now you've got 300 men. The actual size of that army in chapter 8, verse 10, you can just jot it down. After they were defeated and they fled, they said there were 15,000 left because 120 had fallen that day. 135,000 men against 300. 450 to 1. Right? You want to look with our eyes and say, God, this doesn't work. What death trap are you sending me? We just went through the college application process, right? If they said your odds are 1 in 450, don't send in the $50, right? Those are horrific odds that were stacked against Gideon and his army. So after he does for the fleece, while he's standing on the hill, if you look in verse 10 of chapter 7, it happened, or let's go in verse 9 of chapter 7. Here's what God said. It happened the same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down to the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid, here's God again, leading in the process, right? Because you imagine Gideon, of course, he's probably understanding how Gideon feels. Why wouldn't you be afraid? Right? You've got almost a little bigger than people in this room was on our side. And everything we can see is covered over here. He said, if you're afraid, go down into the camp with your servant, and you'll hear what they say. And there's a story of a couple soldiers talking, and a loaf of barley bread tumbles into the camp and all that, and they go, of course, Gideon's going to defeat them. God, again, allowing for that, if you are afraid. See how that faith meter would have been going? Probably wavering pretty crazy inside Gideon. But he acted. He acted upon it. All part of the faith process. And you see, Gideon did these things. He delivered them from such a situation. And that's why you find that he is included in Hebrews 11. It's just an amazing story. It's an amazing time. Would you say it's a Bible story? It doesn't really apply. It's a nice read. We teach it to our children. But how does it have application to me? I think it has everything to do with us. I think it has everything to do with what God wants us to do in terms of us and who we are and how we move through that process of faith building. So at the end this afternoon, I just want to give you five brief takeaways from that story and how we can apply it in our lives, because it's easy for us to be hiding in our proverbial or figurative wine press as well, huddled in a corner, wondering where God is, fearful and afraid. And you pick the topic. I have my own topics. You pick your topic. You know inside your head what that topic could be that paralyzes you, that stops you from moving forward, that asks the question, I've heard those promises, but where is God now? How can you tell me God is with me? I'm going through this horrific trial and difficulty. Where is God? Fear can bring out anger. Fear can bring out hopelessness, discouragement. Right? There's a lot of things that are difficult on the surface to explain away. It's easy to wonder how God has left that and where is He. It's easy to be caught in that spot. But that same man who was in that spot is in the Faith Hall of Fame. Right? So how do we get there ourselves? 5 things this afternoon. First thing I would say is God knows who we are, even if sometimes we forget. God knows who we are. You know, it's interesting. What did the angel of the Lord say when he approached Gideon? The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. This guy is huddled up, trying to get a little wheat for dinner. Right? But he knew who he was. He knew who he was dealing with. You know, sometimes I think when we get into those spots in ourselves, when we wonder who we are, we got to remember in God's Word how He sees us. That's the beautiful thing sometimes in the story of Gideon, seeing it from God's point of view. Now, after the fact, how God sees us. You know, you can just jot down a few verses. You know, I like that verse in John 15:15. We read it during the Passover. He says, "No longer do I call you servants, I call you friends." Right? Sometimes we wonder, does God love us? Are we in His family? I call you friends. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20, you have been bought with a price. We're owned by God. We're part of that family. Look at Romans 8 and all the things that you're led by the Spirit. You are the Son of God. You know, you stop and you start thinking about those things. God sees us a certain way. How does that angel come up to him and call him a mighty man of valor? Right? God sees things a little differently. He sees the value. He sees us a certain way, even though we may forget sometimes. We think God is not viewing us a certain way. Second thing I would mention is God is there every step of the way. You saw it with Gideon. It's easy now when we look back in the Bible, right? And we see that, and God said, okay, if you want to see something, okay, I'll give you a burnt sacrifice over here. I'll do a little fire show on this side. I'll do the fleece thing for you. I'll let you go down and talk, and we'll do all those things. God's walking and working together with Gideon. Sometimes isn't it hard to see that? We're saying that was different. We don't see that, you know, in our lives as much. It's hard for us sometimes to piece that together. But I think one thing that's interesting when God was doing that, when God showed His presence, there was something in Judges 6 and verse 23 that God said after He did the burnt sacrifice, the Lord said to them in verse 23 of chapter 6, peace be with you. Peace is such an elusive thing, but fear is something that kills peace. When we put our trust and our confidence in God, that's when peace is possible. Isn't it a wonderful... There's a song out there now that I've heard recently. It says, fear, he is a liar. And it talks about fear robbing your peace, robbing your rest, stealing your happiness. It's such a powerful thing when we have peace of mind. Peace of mind cannot come when there is fear in the equation. Peace of mind is there. That's what the Lord said. Have peace of mind because I am walking with you. We find peace when we daily are looking for God and His Word. We find peace when we realize God's involved in our lives. I enjoy it sometimes when I talk to people, and you can just tell they realize God is with them in that dark time of weather. It's an amazing thing. When you're like, how would you see that? And I know God understands. God is involved. God is working with me. It's a wonderful thing. It gives you now, I don't have to be in absolute control and figure it out on my own. That's a bad place to be. That brings a lot of fear. Right? When I've got to figure it out. How did Gideon look probably when that angel happened upon him? How are we going to figure this thing out on our own? That's a tough spot that we never want to find ourselves in. And so I always think, we could go all throughout the book and find different verses, but I think at least it works for me sometimes just to have one or two verses that you always have sort of rattling around in your head when you get to those spots. And you wonder, what, God, can He work it out? Does He even know? Where is He in this whole process? Right? Because now we can read the story of Gideon and it's clear in hindsight. Right? But where is God? I'll just give you two verses and we can even turn to those. But they're ones that I will think about from time to time. And I think it's always good to have something at a time of doubt or when you're thinking it, to have a couple of things that you just remember about God. Jeremiah 32 and verse 7. Jeremiah 32. Just a little simple scripture. Jeremiah 32 and verse 7. Ah, Lord God, behold, you made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. Right? Sometimes we'll talk about something and, we'll have a rhetorical question. My wife will say, do you think God can't do that? You think He can't figure that one out? Do you think He doesn't know? You think you got to sit and worry? No, you throw it back to God and say, God, nothing is too great for you. Thank you for being involved every step of the way. And I know your care is great in my life. Isaiah 59 and verse 1. Isaiah 59 and verse 1. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened. It's not that He can't get there quickly or be involved, that it cannot save, nor His ear heavy that it cannot hear. When we trust and we believe, God becomes very big. When we go alone, God becomes quite small. A third thing I would say, growing in faith is a process. Boy, it's a process. You see it all. Well, you see it through the Bible time and time again, right? It's just a process. If it was like 0 to 100 and you were locked in at that spot, wouldn't that be something? But I haven't seen it work quite that way. I just said with Gideon, look at all the things that he had to see and how God worked with him. You heard in the sermonette, Mr. Crone talking about courage at school or at work, right? It's tough. Every day you've got to be ready and say, you know what, I'm putting my trust, my confidence in God. It's a hard spot sometimes. But then you've got to stand, be ready to make the waves and stand against the waves sometime as well. And stand for what's right. Stand for the things and the choices that you want to make. That's what Gideon had to do. I think of faith sometimes. It's like a video game, right? You get those games that got the different levels. And you get to level 1. Well, I got to level 2. And now I got to level 3, right? And you want to keep going. That's what it is. You look at what happened with Gideon. When he said, okay, you have to go out and tear down that altar of Baal. How horrifying would that have been to hear that one? Okay, God, can we start anywhere else, right? That is going to be real. You're thinking in your mind, that's bad. Okay, take that versus facing an army of 135,000 men with 300. Right? He's on the highest level of that video game now. Right? Isn't that how God does it with us sometimes too? And I think sometimes in life, I've heard that. Would you rather see your whole life or not see your life, right? And I think God does it this way because as we step through, it's the same process. And hopefully as time goes on, we can handle more. We've seen more. We've seen what God does. We trust more, and we go on. But it's a process that requires requires us to act as well in that time. You think of the story of Abraham, another one, right? Father of what? Father of the faithful. He wavered, right? He had his moments. But God made promises that he was going to build a nation through him. And then later, we know that whole situation where he asked him to go up and sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Again, an unthinkable situation as a parent or anyone who would just think that through, that you could be in that spot. What level are we in the video game there? You're off the charts, right? And what God says. And then he raises it up, and what does God say? At that point, now I know that you fear the Lord. You've completed, right? You've completed that. Now I know you're my guy, right? You are a man who fears me, a man that will partner with me. No matter what the odds, what's the stake, you will be on my side. It's an amazing thing. Faith. And that's why we get a lifetime to try to keep moving forward. And God gives us, I think it's wonderful. Every day you wake up, we get another shot to say, God, I want to walk with you. Right? Help me. We heard recent messages about, remember the man in the New Testament? Do you believe? I do. But help my unbelief. Right? Fill in the spot that I can't get there by myself. I think it's interesting when you look at when Jesus was resurrected and he came back to the disciples. It's an interesting story, right? Now he has the dubious name of Doubting Thomas. Right, we couldn't really, is that really you? Did that really happen? He said, yeah, here, feel the hole in my hand, right? What did Jesus say? Let's look at what he said. It's pretty profound. John 20 in verse 29. Something I think we should have as a motto too. And Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That's what we're called to. That's what faith is about. We may not see as fully as we want in this lifetime, but we're called to believe. Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe. The fourth thing I would say, we can't be too small for God to use us, but we can be too big. Right? What did he do when he got to the top of the hill with his 32,000? God looked around and said, no. Because if you win, what's going to happen? You're going to think you did it. Got to pare that down. To God be the glory in every situation. We can't be too small for God to use us. God wants us to be small in our own eyes. And then what happens? That peeling away of self and reliance on God and walking in faith, that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing where God says in Isaiah 66, verse 2, we know this verse very well, he will I look to, he who trembles at my word, that's humble. God can use that. God can use that, and he says, now we have someone here that I can partner with when we become small in our own eyes, when we put our trust, our reliance. It's so hard. It sounds so easy what we're saying. These are words, right? But in life, we want to take that control back. We want it. We want some of that glory. We want some of that control. We want all those things humanly. God can't work with that. God says, okay, if we can keep getting smaller on this, don't worry, I have it. Right? Why would they go to war with a pitcher and a trumpet and a torch? Right? So many things don't make sense humanly. They don't add up. God doesn't worry about our math, though. He's not worried about our math. He's got that piece figured out well enough. And the last thing I'll say in point 5 is we need to finish strong. There's a point there at the end of Judges 8. I didn't really spend time on it, but at the end, Gideon left a little mark on himself at the end. After it was all done, he took some of the gold from all their from the war and all their plundering, and he made it into an ephod, which is like a priestly garment with all the gold on it, because he wanted, I think his intention started well, but he wanted to have some of that. Probably he had an altar there. He probably wanted some of that priesthood. But again, God's very specific. There's a priesthood. There's a very much a way God is to be worshipped. And it said the nation of Israel played the harlot to that. And shortly afterwards, they went back into Baal worship. Right? It's so easy to slip at the end. I think of a verse, you can just jot it down in Hebrews 5 and verse 12, because I always have this thought like, yeah, naturally when you get older, what old people don't you know that aren't wise and have it all together, right? That's the way the game of the story is supposed to end, right? Isn't that? Book of Hebrews is pretty interesting because it's written to a church that's probably 30 to 40 years after Jesus had died. Many of us have been 30 or 40 years in the church. Hebrews 5 and verse 12, and he gives a warning. He says, at a time when you should be ready for strong meat, we're going back to the basics again. We're laying the foundations. You're not mature. You're not growing in wisdom. You're not resembling your Father, right? We know the verses about enduring to the end. We had a situation at our house on a somewhat of a side note, but it ties in. I was thinking about it this morning. We had a beautiful maple tree in our front yard. That's our favorite tree. It's this beautiful tree every year, brilliant yellow leaves in the fall, right? This year we waited for that thing, nothing. It's somehow it's dead, so we have to take it out. But I thought about that. I thought, right, why now? Something mysteriously just killed it, right? Unfortunately, sometimes you see that at the end, people get into spots and you're like, wow, never thought that would happen at the end. You've come this far. You've done these things. And a blemish. How much have we seen on that whole, you look in the news on that whole Me Too that's out there. Lives at the end, which should be finishing in a wonderful spot, now wiped out, right? It says, he who endures to the end, the same shall be saved. So when we think about Gideon and what I mentioned this afternoon, the life of Gideon. You think about fear. Fear is a very real emotion, right? And sometimes we will have fear. There's no question about it. But also fear can become an all-consuming thing. Right? We saw it in the life of Gideon. We saw them under a very, very difficult spot where it reduced them to a spot where they were paralyzed, hopeless, discouraged, thinking God was not in the process. I remember hearing an expression long ago, who moved, right? When we think of those things, we could have spent this whole sermon on God. God never changed, never wavered in that process. And when you think about it, we drift over here and we say, where's God? All right, what happened? How could God? No, God has stayed here. We've drifted off, right? And we've gotten to a spot now we've become fearful, disillusioned, discouraged, untrusting. Our faith meter has gone down. But we take hope. We take hope, we take encouragement. I do anyways from the story of Gideon. And I think about a man that was in that spot and how God used him in a very, very powerful way. And took him from really no faith, no trust, to really doing some amazing things. And so we know we are here to become men and women of faith as well. Just as Gideon did. And it starts one day at a time. It starts by knowing that God calls us his sons and daughters. God is active and he's present. We see that in his word. We see it in our lives. We just need to look for it. And discuss that with others. I think that's another powerful thing we can do is discuss faith and how our faith has grown and where we've been tested, and share those stories with each other and build each other up and walk together in faith and help encourage each other. And through that process, we stay small. We stay small in our own eyes. And we learn to trust. And it takes a lifetime. It's a process. But then hopefully we do that and we cross across the finish line. And I still think there's unwritten Hebrews 11 part 2. That would be great one day if we also find ourselves in the Hebrews Faith Hall of Fame.